Florida State Seminoles have been as compelling off the field as on the field. Let's get down to business. When are they getting out of the ACC?
You are Locked On ACC, your daily podcast on the Atlantic Coast Conference. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Shout out to the everydayers, and thank you so much for making Locked On ACC your first listen and your first watch today. We're available free wherever you get your podcasts. We're free on YouTube. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by 5 Hour Energy. They fix tired fast with zero sugar, convenient, portable size. It's the perfect pick-me-up for getting stuff done. Go to 5hourenergy.com. Use promo code LOCKEDONCFB to receive 20% off your order. This offer is only valid till September 30th on one order. Cannot be used with other promotions. Go to 5hourenergy.com today. So thrilled on this episode. Kenton, Gibbs, and I are joined by the guy who has kept us so informed on the Florida State versus ACC and ACC versus Florida State lawsuits. We have Doug Rohan of Rohan Law with us. By the way, on this episode, we will also discuss some big underdogs this weekend on the ACC schedule and who might be able to pull off some upsets potentially. But Mr. Rohan, we appreciate your time. And I want to start with this because, again, you've been such a great resource on these lawsuits. And I know that, gosh, so much of the stuff that's happening in court is up to interpretation. When we hear about this opt-out opportunity that ESPN has with the ACC TV deal coming up in February of 2025, prior to that renewal period in 2027, if ESPN were to maybe want to stay in the ACC business but opt out and create a new TV deal, if they alter the TV deal in any way, is that grant of rights still valid until 2036, or can they essentially tear it up and throw it out?
Well, Alex and Kenton, thank you so much for having me on. I've been following you guys for several months as well, and really been pleased with what you all have been able to bring as far as newsworthy information from the other ACC teams. So yes, I am absolutely a homer. I wore my colors just to be clear so that there wouldn't be any accusation of me hiding. But look, this all started because I love Florida State, but I also love the law. I do practice as an attorney. I will be transparent and admit I did not jump on this right away because this is not my practice area. I know all of these terms from going to law school, from dealing with contracts and studying for the bar exam. All attorneys have to have a general scope of knowledge. And I was more than happy to let somebody else fill this space in. But by the time we saw the questions coming out when these lawsuits were being filed, I decided, okay, well, I'll come on board. I'm going to be transparent and honest. I'm the bus driver. I'm not telling you where we're going, but I can certainly point out the window and explain to you what we're passing. And so that's kind of the approach that I've tried to take over this now coming up on 11 months, 10 months of this litigation. And so that's all we want to do here is just try and explain and break it down in a way that the Twitter followers can understand, can speak intelligently. And I've been really pleased with what I've seen in the Discord because folks like you then take that information, share it, and then that keeps all of the craziness from percolating to the surface. We get really intelligent conversations. So to your question, my interpretation, the way I understood this, is not how I started this case. And I want people to understand that's not uncommon for lawyers to do. You go through this process of peeling back the layers of the onion and understanding things in different terms. Just like everybody else, when they said that this was a ironclad grant of rights, we didn't have any reason to disagree with that. So we ran with that. That's what was in the sound bites. And it wasn't until I actually started to peel back the layers after Clemson's lawsuit that I really began to understand what the allegations were. So first off, just a little bit of history. The grant of rights that the ACC is using, the ACC copied the homework of the Big 12. So when they did their grant of rights, they copied that agreement, but they made some very important changes. And the first of which is that the grant of rights in the Big 12 that they were copying said ESPN agreement, Fox agreement, other media partner agreements. When the ACC got this document and they created the ACC grant of rights, they were so comfortable with the ESPN relationship that they only put ESPN in the ACC grant of rights. So that's the first problem. The first problem is that we have an irrevocable grant of rights that is tied specifically and solely to the existence of an ESPN agreement, not ESPN and or Fox and or any other media partners that they have in the future. So yes, the first linchpin is what's going to happen in February of 2025 when ESPN needs to decide whether or not they're going to exercise the option. The second historical thing that I want to share with your viewers is that if you go back to when these hearings first started, I went to the Mecklenburg County Courthouse and actually observed the first hearing, and that's what launched our Twitter page. I was live tweeting everything that was going on. But the judge there, Judge Bledsoe, made a huge deal about the fact that the ACC was arguing and trying to make stuff secret that they weren't arguing in the Florida suit down in Leon County. And that's because the complaint that Florida State initially filed was the one that disclosed all this language about this February 2025 look-in. Now, the ACC has suggested and has posited, has stated that this is a look-in provision, which just means, hey, let's take a look and see if it's still fair for everybody. That's not what the provision says. The provision says very clearly ESPN has a unilateral and unobligatory opportunity to decide if it wants to continue the contract. That's not a look-in provision, that's an option. So ESPN right now is the sole decision maker on whether or not they want to continue after February 1st, 2025, beyond the 2027 season. If they choose not to, then there is no grant of rights beyond 2027.
Wow. First of all, permission to treat the witness as hostile, Donno. No, but seriously, I 1,000% agree, and I've agreed with everybody in terms of, hey, if the ESPN deal goes up in smoke, the grant of rights goes up in smoke. That's been something that I've been consistent on from the beginning. But one thing that I've had a very clear stance on as well is that ESPN has the ACC raked over the coals. That it would not necessarily make a ton of sense for them to say, hey, I get that y'all are making a lot more money than we are spending on you all, but we're going to cut you loose anyway. But, I mean, we've seen some of the moves that ESPN has made lately. Everything doesn't make sense on its face. But with that in mind, while we talk about where we are right now, in terms of where this case is, how it plays out, all that good stuff, if you were to say, hey, this case has a lifespan or a life cycle much like certain animals, what point would you say this is where we are, right? Like, this case is headed towards like, hey, it's becoming fully matured and developed, and there's like legitimate, we're getting into discovery, getting into the things, or is it more so we're still in its infancy? We're just learning to crawl. We're just learning to not touch hot stoves and all that in terms of where this case is. Where would you say?
That's a great analogy. And that was exactly one of the points of emphasis that we had early on in this. Everybody was all excited when the lawsuits started getting filed and the complaints and answers and motions. And I was like, folks, we are still trying to figure out which stadium we're going to play the game in. Is this in North Carolina or is this in Tallahassee? So to your point, from a litigation standpoint, we're still at the opening kickoff. Now, with that being said, Judge Cooper in Florida has said, all gas, no brakes. We're going to let you go up to the Court of Appeals on this issue of jurisdiction, but you waived the argument of venue by not refiling it, not restating it. So as far as I'm concerned, Florida is the appropriate place, and very likely the Court of Appeals is going to agree. So in the meantime, we're moving forward with discovery. We already had court-ordered mediation. That was not successful. That was not a surprise at all. The litigation moves forward. Folks, litigation at this level takes 2 to 3 years. So if we're going to go down the litigation path of this case, yes, we're still going to be talking about this well into the 2026, 2027 season. What is most likely, and I've said since our first podcast, is this is going to be a case that settles. Now, what is that number and which party is going to capitulate first? That's the big question, because both parties are right now saying, Florida State we're at $140 million. We'll pay the exit fee. We know that we got to pay that. Although we have an argument that that's an unenforceable penalty. So if you make us go down this litigation route, it could be less. Whereas the ACC is saying, we know the number's around $524 million for the life of this contract through 2036. And in fact, the number is going to keep going up as we get these new agreements with ESPN. So that number could be as high as 700 million. And if we have to litigate that, we're still going to go down that route. The difference is, and this is something that everybody keeps forgetting, if Florida State loses, a judge is not going to tell Florida State to pay $525 million. Right. All they say is you have to stay in the ACC.
Right.
That is a loss. So that's why when people are like, why is FSU doing this? Why aren't they just behaving? Because they see an existential crisis to their existence as a program, and they don't lose anything by raising hell and trying to get out. Now, if that number is 300 million or less, the maths. Based on how much the projected new earnings are in the new conferences and the Power 2 conferences, which I have every confidence there is a landing space. We had 5 million people hate watching Florida State and Ireland underperform. The reality is that they draw the eyeballs. So there is a market for them in one of the Power 2 conference tables at some point. The question is, how much is it going to cost to get there, and does Florida State want to pay that money? And that's why February is the important date to me. To go to your question, Kenton, there is a chance and there is a reasonable likelihood that this case is resolved either at the end or close to the end of this football season. And I think that's going to include, because we're already past the August 15th deadline to announce, that's going to include this season and next season in the ACC. I think the ACC will be happy with that. Gets them an extra year that they would have had if Florida State had announced something sooner. And in the meantime, it gives Florida State a longer runway to negotiate with the Power 2 conferences. Remember, they just had realignment. We're going to talk about realignment at the end. You can't have change after change after change after change in a short period of time. You have to have what's called change management. There are adaptations. There are adjustments that need to be made. There's new things that are learned with every one of these realignments, and you want to apply that to the next round of realignment. So waiting until the 2026 season seems to me to make the best sense for Florida State.
Well, we're going to continue the conversation here with Doug Rohan Law. I'm learning a lot already, and he mentioned something about how Florida State facing an existential crisis. Is this an existential crisis for the ACC if they lose Florida State and Clemson? I want to continue this conversation. You guys want to keep it locked? We're not done yet. We're only getting started on this brand new episode of Locked On ACC. And you already know I'm only getting started with 5 Hour Energy. I mean, guys, I need that afternoon pick-me-up. I know you're not the only ones. We get tired after lunch. Research shows that more than 70% of us hit the wall after lunch. Let a 5 Hour Energy shot help you leap over that wall instead of crashing into it. Folks, with zero sugar and a convenient portable size, it's the perfect pick-me-up for getting stuff done. The 5 Hour Energy website has the flavors galore, like watermelon, tropical burst, grape, berry, so much more. There's a flavor for everyone. On the site, you even have the option to build your own 12-pack or 24-pack. You choose the flavors, and it's delivered right to your door. If you go to 5hourenergy.com, that's the number 5hourenergy.com, get some 5 Hour Energy product today. You can use our promo code LOCKEDONCFB to receive 20% off your order. This order only valid till September 30th on one order, cannot be used with other promotions. The code is not good on subscription orders. Go to 5hourenergy.com today. Thank you so much for making Locked On ACC your first listen today. Make sure you check out our other shows. Kenton does an awesome job on Locked On Wolfpack. I host Locked On Canes. It's nice to have that Florida State representation today with Doug Rohan. And so, Doug, you talked about existential crisis for Florida State, like, of course, all the revenue that they're missing out on not being in the Power 2. But then on the flip side of it, this is why Jim Phillips says he's going to fight for as long as it takes the ACC commissioner. If Florida State and Clemson either straight up win in court or if they reach favorable settlement terms, is there a chance that others can follow them out the door?
If I were advising the ACC, the goal would be to make the number as high as possible so that only Clemson, Florida State, and maybe a choice few others like North Carolina and Miami can afford it. And then you reinvest that money that gets paid into your coffers to gird the rest of the conference and let's make some sense of what's going to happen next. If Miami stays behind and Miami is going to become the new bell cow of the ACC, Alex, we need to start marketing to that South Florida market and get that stadium filled. We need to make sure that there are viewers. We need to make sure that people want to watch. I remember the crazy heydays of the Florida Panthers when they were playing for championships and people were watching. It's all about marketing. So they need to go to the other ACC schools and say, are you serious about football? Pitt, are we going to reestablish that Marino-esque history and legacy that we had? Are we going to NC State? Are you going to take the next step? Because you darn sure has been a thorn in Florida State's side every once in a while. So we want to make sure that that becomes a consistent performance from those middle tier schools. I hate that we lost to Georgia Tech, but I sure as heck want Georgia Tech to win out for the rest of the season to not be a piss poor matchup. Last year, the reason why the committee, I'm not going to say was justified, but had even an argument to shun Florida State in the college football playoff is because there wasn't a number 3 school behind Clemson. Everybody else was 5-4, 6-6, 7-2. The conference as a whole needs to get better if they want to remain a Power 4 program, if they want to establish themselves as one of those top 4 conferences, or alternatively, just go all in on basketball. Bring in UConn, set up the triangle, the North Carolina Triangle as a basketball powerhouse, be that preeminent basketball conference, and move the football to G5, because that is how you are treating the conference. There's been so many opportunities of mismanagement throughout all of these years of negotiations, and that's why Florida State was throwing crap against the wall in their complaints, because they wanted the world to see. Why was it that Raycom was such an integral part of these third-tier productions? Why was it so beneficial for ESPN to move forward? Why did they give a 3-year extension when there wasn't any consideration for ESPN to even decide if they want to continue on through 2036? All of those were chances that the ACC had to assert themselves and establish themselves, but they have historically operated from a point of fear as opposed to a point of power, and they are now reaping what they sow. So to take the long way around to your answer, if they were to negotiate a $220 million settlement, then only 2, 3, maybe 4 players max can afford that. If they litigate, Florida State and Clemson only need to win on 1 of their 7 counts. ACC has to win on all counts in both suits in order for this to continue on to 2036. And that is a game of Russian roulette, where instead of playing with 1 bullet in the chamber, they're playing with 5 bullets in the chamber and 1 that's not. So the ACC, if I were advising them, should actively work towards a January settlement in the $200 million range and make sure that they only lose 2, 3, 4 members of the conference.
One thing that is a constant, if you've ever had to deal with lawyers at a moderate to high level, is there's not a definitive yes or no ever. There's always this is your percentage. This is an uphill battle. It may not work for you. It may not work against you. But let me ask you this. There's the idea that, hey, the ACC is playing a game of Russian roulette where every slot of the chamber except 1 is going to be filled. But let me ask you, from the standpoint of looking at Florida State and Clemson potentially being in a situation where they are to lose this thing, what would you say those chances look like? What would you say the odds are that, hey, the ACC really does find favorable decisions here in their cases, or at least enough favorable decisions to where, again, let's just say Florida State wins in Florida, Clemson wins in South Carolina, but the ACC wins both in North Carolina. Now we're taking this thing to a higher level. What do you think that looks like?
This is why I have said from, again, the first time I was hosting that there would be a settlement. We just learned last month from the Ohio State Supreme Court that boneless chicken wings can have bones in them. That was the decision of the Ohio State Supreme Court. It was not poor advertising to say that the restaurant had boneless chicken wings and the restaurant patron found a bone in his chicken wing. So that's what litigation does. It creates nonsense. It creates an asinine world where words matter and what is, and David McKenzie went, brutal on, there's no way that these cases are going to turn on the phrase the. That's not true. These cases turn on stupid phrases all the time. And that's why this will never see any true litigation. There will not be a judgment from any judge that has a material effect on the outcome of this case. It will settle. I don't know when. I don't know for how much. There is no chance because, to your point, Ken, we have 4 cases operating in 3 states, and nobody has said we don't want to hear this case yet. The Supreme Court of North Carolina hasn't even issued an order whether or not they're going to take Florida State's appeal on the issue of whether North Carolina is the appropriate place for this to be. The Court of Appeals in Florida, on an expedited basis, is another 30 days out from even hearing whether or not this is a case that should be heard in Florida. A decision just on which state we're going to play in and what playground we're going to play in is 6 months away. And nobody wants this to drag out that far. Nobody wants this to go on to 2026, 2027, 2028. And as it does, as each year passes, that number of what the cost is just keeps going down. So that's why I say this case will settle. There will not be a judgment. And I would be more shocked. I can't even come up with a scenario. I cannot envision a single scenario where this goes to a judge for a judge to decide, because you have the chaos of 3 different states trying to figure out what's going on.
Yeah.
So wait a minute.
Go ahead.
Well, just one more thing here. So you were the first person that I've ever heard throw out a number as high as 700 million. That's the highest I've ever heard. I've heard 540, 550, possibly on the crazy side, or not even crazy. Let me not use that word, but on the absurd side, 6. Yeah. And yet you threw out the number 700, but you're also telling me that this likely settles for a lower amount than the 300 that you said, hey, this number keeps them in the conference. Where does that juxtaposition of those 2 numbers kind of exist? Where does that come in at? 700
was mentioned by, I believe it was the Florida State attorneys in the North Carolina case orally. What you write down carries more weight than what you say. The purpose of saying things during a hearing is to focus or to bring attention to something you've already said in your brief. There's very little that gets said in a hearing that's of merit or that's of consequence. Now, the judge asks some questions, and that's where things can get interesting. For instance, the ACC attorneys in the hearing agreed that this was an option on the part of ESPN in February when they were grilling them in North Carolina. But that's not what Jim Phillips is going to say from the podium in the middle of the ACC media days. Right. So the way that I reach my ultimate figure and my supposition is Florida State doesn't have to pay $500 million under any set of circumstances. They just will give up or will have to wait until 2036 to get $524 million. Now, we want to negotiate a prepayment on that amount. We don't want to wait until 2036. So the number's not zero. There is an exit fee of $140 million, which if you look at the history, there was a $0 exit fee in 2010. 2010. In 2013, it was $5 million. In 2016, it was $7 million. In 2018, it was $24 million. So it has escalated as all of these conference realignment discussions have been going on through the years. That's why now that number is at $140 million. Remember, it's a percentage of the operation budget. Well, who's in control of the operation budget? The ACC is in control of the ACC's operation budget. And what do they want to do right now? They want to stop people from leaving, so they're going to increase their operations budget as much as they can. So there is an argument that you can't go from zero to $140 million in less than 10 years and make a reasonable argument as to why that is liquidated damages. Liquidated damages has to be something that reasonably reflects the loss of income or the penalty that will the harm that will be caused. So that's why FSU has an argument, at least, that it's not $140 million. But let's set that aside for now and assume that we're starting at $140 million, assume that they're starting at $500 million. The number and the result is somewhere in between. And like I said, for Florida State, the math is anything under $300 million, and you want it to be something substantially under $300 million. Because if it's $298 million, stop wasting money on the attorney's fees. Might as well just stay. But if you're going to get out for $250, $240, $220, then I can see a scenario where, again, Clemson and Florida State can afford that. Pitt and Virginia Tech cannot.
Wow. Well, I've learned a ton, and if you guys want to keep learning from Doug, his X account is awesome. And anytime there is a hearing, this is the man you need to follow at Rohan Law PC. And I've seen Doug do awesome work also on the College Football Addiction podcast. I think that's where I first saw Doug before I started following him on X. So thank you so much for taking the time and for educating a couple dummies like us. We thank you so much.
My pleasure to be here. I'm always happy to talk football with rational fans.
I love it. And yeah, Kenton and I will talk some ball. We'll talk about who might get upset this weekend. You want to keep it locked right here on Locked On ACC. And I already know you're keeping it locked to FanDuel. We've been winning money all summer, and now football season is back. We just got through week 0. Week 1 is coming up, and you know what? We've got a little something different for you here on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Then with a YouTube TV base plan, you'll be able to watch every regular season Sunday afternoon out-of-market game. All you need is a Google account and a current form of payment, and you can cancel anytime. So, guys, if you want to place that $5 bet on one of the games this weekend, we're about to talk, Kenton and I, about any of the big favorites who may go down or at least not cover those spreads. Check it out on FanDuel. Take advantage of this awesome opportunity. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to download America's #1 sportsbook. We are also proudly brought to you here on the Locked On Network by Factor Meals. They're helping me get my nutrition on. The options, the minimal prep time, it's amazing. No prep, no mess meals. Meet your wellness goals thanks to the menu of chef-created meals with options like Calorie Smart, Protein Plus, and Keto. Factor's fresh, never frozen meals are dietitian approved and ready to eat in just 2 minutes. So no matter how busy you are, you'll always have time to enjoy nutritious, great tasting meals. Make today the day you kickstart a new healthy routine. What are you waiting for? With 35 different meals and more than 60 add-ons to choose from every week, you'll always have new flavors to explore. Crush your wellness goals with dietitian-approved meals and ingredients you can trust. Keep kitchen time to a minimum, by the way. Factor meals are ready to eat, in 2 minutes. No shopping, no prepping, no cooking or cleaning up. Head to factormeals.com/LockedOnCollege50 and use code LockedOnCollege50 to get 50% off your first box plus 20% off your next month. That's code LockedOnCollege50 at factormeals.com/LockedOnCollege50 to get 50% off your first box plus 20% off your next month while your subscription is active. Thank you so much for making this episode of Locked On ACC your first listen and your first watch today. Make sure you check out The Squad. It's coming out later today, or maybe it's already later today, depending on when you're watching this. We talk about all the matchups coming up this weekend. But, Kenton, something else that we wanted to get to here, because you've got some big favorites this weekend, big ACC teams that are big favorites this weekend. I'm looking at some of these spreads, Mr. Gibbs. NC State favored by 32.5 at home against Western Carolina. Wake Forest favored by 35 against North Carolina A&T. Duke favored by 23.5 against Elon. Let's see. This is not, I guess, a huge favorite, but Virginia Tech are 13.5-point favorites on the road at Vanderbilt. Pittsburgh, 24.5-point favorites at home against Kent State. Cal, 20.5-point favorites against UC Davis. I didn't even know UC Davis had a football team. I've heard of them before, but no idea.
The mighty Aggies of UC Davis? You don't know about
them. You also have a big favorite, Georgia Tech, riding high off of their upset win against Florida State. They are 20.5-point favorites against Georgia State. So you have some big point spreads there, Kenton, but which of those teams do you think is most likely to catch the upset bug if somebody's getting beaten this weekend?
So, I struggled with this. I went back and forth because I said of all the teams, who do I think can pull off the outright upset? That was the first thought I had. And I'm like, I'm struggling to find it. I really and truly am. Even if you wanted to say, hey, Vanderbilt is a team that, they have a really big spread as an SEC team against them. Of course, they lost both of their starting quarterback or their top two quarterbacks. They lost a ton of top talent from last year. I struggle as well to see where you would say that they're a team that could compete here. And then I said, well, maybe you could look at Wake Forest and North Carolina A&T. That could be one where you possibly say, what's going on here? What could possibly be a team that you would think Wake Forest would be by 35 when, objectively speaking, last year they were god-awful. Well, so was North Carolina A&T. They were god-awful at the FCS level. I think Wake covers. Where we have some value is from the NC State and Western Carolina game.
I agree.
Not in the game. The offensive coordinator was the head coach last year's son, and he took off to go to Pitt. That is the connection. Pitt, Kent State. I'm telling you right now, Kent is going to cover that spread, and they may win that game outright.
Wow.
I have no faith in the Panthers. First-year offensive coordinator, while he dominated at Western Carolina, I'm not sure if Nate Yarnell has the goods that it takes to do the special things that they need to do. They have a running back that followed his offensive coordinator from Western Carolina up there to Pittsburgh, took his talents to Pennsylvania as well. I'm not sure if he has the goods at the FBS level to run all over a Kent State. And then the worst part, you and I talked about this during the offseason, your captains are leaving the team because they don't believe you can win. Kent State, I got them to cover, and damn it, they might outright pull the upset out there at Heinz Field. I don't care what they call it now. His mama named him Heinz Field, so I'm going to call him Heinz Field. They may pull off the upset.
See, I like that. Where I thought you were going to go with that was just not winning the game outright, but I thought you were going to go Western Carolina just covering the 32.5-point spread against NC State, because that's such a gigantic spread. It's like as a matter of principle. I mean, if NC State pulls all their starters before halftime, and if they decide they feel like running the ball a lot in that game, it could slow the game down. So it's like, as a matter of principle, when I see a spread that big, I would usually bet the underdog, certainly not to win the game, just to cover the big time spread. What about any chance that Georgia Tech is up for a letdown game against Georgia State? I'm just saying, like, you feel like you're on top of the world. You're like Goliath after beating Florida State in Dublin. You have that long flight back home. It would be easy to overlook Georgia State, but for Georgia State, this game is their Super Bowl. They're 20.5-point dogs. Like, hasn't Georgia State pulled off big upsets, at least one in the past? Like, I don't know, man.
The inaugural Marta Bowl, as they call it, because these are the two closest teams in all of college football. No two teams are closer. I believe they're separated by like 2 or 3 miles or something like that. You can run from one campus to the other.
Well, maybe you can. I can't run 3 miles.
You're giving yourself much too little credit. But in all seriousness, Donno, as much as I hate to say it, I feel like you're a little right. But I will say this game will speak a lot to who Georgia Tech is. And I mean that from this standpoint, because I know Georgia Tech fans are probably hearing this and they've shut their ears off. They cut us off and said that, they just want to hate on Georgia Tech. Wait with me. Stick with me. If Georgia Tech comes out and dominates this game, that tells me this is a team on a mission. That tells me this is a team that is doing it the right way every single time. Now, I want to give you a fun fact about Georgia Tech from last year that many people forget. That is the same team, the exact same team that found a way to upset a top 25 team in North Carolina. And then after they upset number 17, North Carolina, they went on to get waxed by 3 touchdowns against Clemson. That's an actual thing that happened. The same team that beat a ranked North Carolina lost to Boston College. Castellanos put on a show, no ifs, ands, or buts about it, but that is what I mean by last year's Georgia Tech team. They weren't on a mission. They were not fully locked into we're going to have the right countenance for every game because anybody can beat us. We're not that good yet. If this Georgia Tech team goes out and lays the absolute lumber on Georgia State in the inaugural Marta Bowl, I am telling you right now, this Georgia Tech team needs to be taken seriously, and their odds may not jump to a much higher number in terms of ACC championship potential to at least go. But I'll sprinkle something on it. I'll sprinkle something on because that is a team, who knows? They could easily end up there if they continue on the path that they're on.
I like that. And great times on this episode. Huge thanks to Doug Rohan of Rohan Law for joining us, dropping some knowledge with us. We'll see if Georgia Tech catches that upset bug. Not saying it's going to happen, but hangover games are real after you win a game big that they just won. Like, hangover games are real. I probably have PTSD because I'm a Miami fan. That's probably my problem here. We will talk to you guys again next time on another episode of Locked On ACC. We're part of the awesome Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.